orden de ideas, nuestra primera exponente será Mrs. Corinne Kane, which is there on the other side, quien es analista política de la División de Asuntos Corporativos de la OCDE y quien, entiendo, nos ha preparado una pequeña presentación para presentar los resultados de la encuesta que realizaron en Sudáfrica. Corinne, thank you very much. And you have up to 15 minutes to make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my presentation will focus on issues and trends in national practices towards preventing corruption in state-owned enterprises. In preparation for this meeting, the OECD Secretariat conducted a survey of national practices to which 7 countries contributed. And I'll focus my presentation first on an overview of who contributed, then discussing key sources of corruption risk in SOEs, and meaning corruption risks that are specific to state-owned enterprises. And then finally, I'll move on and discuss issues and transnational practices in 4 areas: the legal and institutional landscape, the professionalism and independence of boards of directors, internal controls, ethics and compliance measures, and finally, the role of disclosure and transparency in preventing corporate misconduct. And I'll end with some issues for discussion by the panel today or further investigation for the work of this network, the OECD, going forward. So the issues paper is based on responses to a survey developed by the OECD Secretariat. We've received responses from Argentina, India, Lithuania, Malaysia, Mexico, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And this builds on broader OECD work on business integrity, and notably a stock-taking of national practices in Southern Africa that was conducted under the auspices of the OECD Southern Africa Network on Corporate Governance of SOEs. And following this meeting, the OECD's intention is to incorporate national practices from the Southern Africa work, and also to invite other countries to contribute to the study. So, first of all, looking at the legal and institutional landscape. Most of the countries surveyed for this issues paper have adhered to relevant international or regional anti-corruption instruments, and notably the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And in so doing, they have committed to bring their national anti-corruption legislation in line with international standards. And also in so doing, most of the countries have legislated against specific corruption offenses identified in the United Nations Anti-Corruption Convention. You can see in this graph, which is kind of small actually, that there are some gaps in anti-corruption legislation, but broadly speaking, since 2003, most countries have made progress in legislating against corruption, so applicable broadly, not specific to state-owned enterprises. So what are some of the enforcement issues that are specific to state-owned enterprises? Firstly, we found that prevailing anti-corruption legislation, when it is in place, does not systematically apply to state-owned enterprises. This can either be because SOEs are not incorporated according to company law and thus not subject to corporate liability where such is in place, or because the employees or board members of SOEs are not subject to the same liability as a board member would be in a private company. So there are issues with board member liability that are specific to state-owned enterprises. And secondly, issues of enforcement, which are already present in the countries, can be exacerbated in the state-owned sector in particular, because the state might be unwilling to bring cases against the SOEs that it quote-unquote owns. And in this regard, we also found that there is scope for improving institutional coordination in the fight against corruption. And we understand from the survey responses from Mexico that they're currently considering a new law which would create an anti-corruption national system, which would create an instance of coordination among the different bodies working to fight against corruption. So practices like this would be useful to examine further and to look at how they could be applied to other countries. Now, moving on to the second topic on professionalism and independence of boards of directors, we identified 2 overarching issues in this regard in the fight against corruption. First of all, boards of directors have limited mandates, either in law or in practice, which prevent them from fulfilling the key corporate functions of setting strategy and overseeing management based on clear performance objectives defined by the state. So for example, this was discussed in the last session as well, and in some countries, and in fact in many countries, the state bypasses SOE boards of directors to elect the CEO, thus rendering the board somewhat ineffective in shielding the SOE from political interference. In at least one country, the CEO appointment was cited as a specific source of increased corruption risk in the SOE sector. And secondly, persistent issues with the composition and qualifications of boards may prevent them from exercising independent judgment and acting in the interest of the enterprise. Again, this has been discussed earlier today, but the presence of politically affiliated individuals serving on the board was cited as a serious area of increased corruption risk. So now moving on to internal controls, ethics, and compliance measures. The International Good Practice Guidelines of the SOE guidelines call for SOEs to put in place internal controls, ethics, and compliance measures, among others, to prevent fraud and corruption. We found through this survey and also other work conducted by the OECD that SOEs are not systematically required to establish such internal controls, ethics, and compliance measures, and that national practices vary depending on SOE's level of corporatization and their functional independence from the state. So this is a sort of simplified schema at the bottom of this slide. On the one hand, we have SOEs that are basically operated out of the general government and generally subject to the internal control system of the federal government. And then on the far right-hand corner, we have SOEs that are highly corporatized, who have a company-level internal control, reporting to the board. So perhaps this is an area for further investigation and distilling elements of good practice of the two sort of types of systems along this spectrum of corporatization versus general government. And secondly, we found that there is no harmonized regime for codes of ethics applicable to the board members and employees of SOEs. In some countries, SOE employees fall under the scope of public sector codes of ethics. In other countries, there is no requirement for SOEs to develop codes of ethics, and in both cases, some state-owned enterprises do develop such codes of ethics on an ad hoc basis. We also found that in a couple of countries, notably India and the Philippines, the government promotes action at the board level by requiring boards of directors to develop some sort of code of ethics. And in India, it's actually linked to the performance evaluation system. So it's a means of sort of incentivizing SOE boards to develop such codes and implement them. And now on the fourth topic of disclosure and transparency. The two overarching conclusions in this area are that at the level of individual SOEs, significant issues persist concerning the quality and the credibility of corporate disclosure. In many cases, this reflects that SOEs are not incorporated according to general company law, so they're not required to put in place the same accounting, auditing, and reporting requirements. Or for SOEs that are statutory corporations, for example, the government does not develop equally stringent reporting requirements. And in the same vein, SOEs' financial statements are not always subject to an independent external audit, which raises significant issues about the credibility of the disclosure that SOEs are undertaking. Also in this area, in some countries there appears to be perhaps an overlap between the role of external auditors and the role of state auditors. So this is perhaps an area for further investigation in better clarifying the respective remits of the external auditor and the state auditor. And I will end with a few words on aggregate reporting. So having just spoken about reporting at the level of the company, now reporting at the level of the state, as aggregate reporting can be a means of increasing the accountability of the state as an owner to report to the general public about the activities and performance of state-owned enterprises. So we have found, and actually this goes beyond the scope of the current survey, but draws on the work of the OECD Working Party on State Ownership. We have found that countries around the world are increasingly undertaking aggregate reporting on SOEs, although it's not a universal practice. So for example, in a survey of 46 countries, we found that 18 of them undertook aggregate reporting on all SOEs. And while an additional 12 either made information on SOEs available online or conducted aggregate reporting on a portfolio of SOEs. That would apply to the case of a state holding company that has a limited portfolio of SOEs on which it discloses information on financial performance. And concerning the contents of aggregate reports, generally speaking, most of them report on SOE's financial performance and value. A smaller percentage report on the implementation of the state ownership policy. And then at the smallest number of countries include information on the costs and the funding of SOE's public policy objectives. So that could be an area where improved aggregate reporting could be encouraged in line with the OECD guidelines. So I included in this slide the questions that were in the issues paper for further discussion. I don't think that I'll go through them right now, but I'll end there. And again, we would welcome any additional country contributions to this paper to build on the OECD's ongoing work on business integrity in state-owned enterprises. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Corinne.
Thank you, Corinne. I think your presentation has been very interesting, and it clearly shows the tension between the countries that complying with conventions issues standards or legislation, but when applying them on state-owned enterprises face difficulty given the nature of the enterprises themselves, and on the other hand, because they are these entities that are not private, they are not public, or they need to work in the market, but at the same time they are subjected to government requirements, and the difficulty the countries are facing trying to find corporate governance models that comply with these rules simultaneously, and of course resistance at state-owned enterprises to abide by these principles, given the reasons that have been stated on the presentation. I believe that it refers to an important number of things. She mentioned the case of Mexico, and as an anecdote, I would say that one of the major discussions is if this new anti-corruption regime will be fully implemented on state-owned enterprises, or if they are going to have a special status given their nature and activity in a competitive market. So this is one of the subjects we have to keep working on. Now I'm going to introduce Jorge Fabre, who is academic vice president of Anáhuac del Sur. He has broad experience in the business school, but also as professor of management and corporate governance school. So I would ask Jorge Fabre to please give his presentation. Thank you, Jorge. That's very kind of you. I apologize because my experience is more in the private sector than in the public sector. And also, as an anecdote, in the last 6 years, we've designed a methodology to measure corporate governance, social responsibility, and the environmental practices of publicly listed companies. And we find an evolution in terms of performance, not only financially, but actually on integrity, on responsibly driving the businesses, talking about the companies that complied with international best practices, basically in corporate governance. And I refer to international because the best corporate governance role and the stock exchange have demands below the institutional demands at an international level, basically for pension funds and, of course, mutual funds that, as you know, are the main actors of the financial global markets. And attention to demands for those that have to give profit for future generations, because basically you're talking about retirement of workers in 10, 25, 30 years. The reality is that we clearly noticed how there is causality in good practices of professional management of a company and its results, and of course with the likelihood of it being sustainable, that it's sustainable in the long term. And that is the index called IPC in Mexico's stock exchange. And from this experience, I can summarize from the OECD's guidelines for corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. It's been some time that I've been talking to Andres Bernal or Daniel Bloom about this, and that's if we only think about commercial companies, state-owned companies in my country, there are very few left now. Therefore, for some time now, we've felt that, of course, there is another type of entity in the public sector that have a public service role that could be largely benefited by corporate governance practices. So I just summarized 5 of the recommendations that for corruption, specifically speaking, in my opinion, in my country, are more important to deal with, where we have much more to gain. The first one is basic, and it's this recognition of the fact that since the state is the owner, then accountability, transparency, and ethical management is way much more important than that of the private sector, as I said in the beginning of this presentation. Therefore, this, in my opinion, is the starting point. Citizens need more accountability from state-owned enterprises than what they need to have when they invest their money in shares of a company of the private sector and on which they expect certain yield. And y deben saber que ejercen sus derechos y solo lo hacen en el interés del público en general, y esto justifica los grandes niveles de rendición de cuentas y transparencia que los que aplican a empresas privadas similares. And quickly, it seems to me that the second recommendation that best applies to fight corruption in corporate governance would be precisely for governments to perfectly well understand among the types of enterprises or companies they have, which they own, whether they are commercial entities or with commercial objectives, semi-commercial or partially subsidized entities that, in addition to have a commercial objective, they also have a social or public objective. And the third type that OECD describes, and those are the ones that receive subsidy because their objective is mainly social and public. In this definition, it's worth thinking in detail about the number of agencies, not only at a federal level, also at a state and municipal level. Public services agencies, water commissions at a state level, etc. The different services that the states need to provide to their citizens and how they would be benefited from having corporate governance, to have management boards, advisors, or professional management boards. And this brings me to my third recommendation that I believe is extremely important to fight corruption. The boards of SOEs should be required to develop, implement, and communicate internal codes of ethics. These should apply to all employees, senior management, and of course, to the board members themselves. And this brings me to the example I was saying about private companies enlisted in the Mexican stock exchange. In the university, when we rate these, or when we rank companies with the best corporate governance in Mexico, and this is the most profitable index of the stock exchange in Mexico, we rank 0 in ethics codes when there is no ethics code of the management board, because it's very easy to have an ethics code for employees, But we know that major corruption events take place at a higher level, not at the lower level. When you only pay attention to the minor codes of ethics of organizations in the private sector, of course you see improvements, but not the major ones. The major ones usually take place at a higher level, and the management board themselves, with their example, need to rule. You rule by example, not with anything else. So this is a very important recommendation. The fourth recommendation I always like to highlight is that management boards should ensure that the company's ethics is effectively managed and that the results of the company in ethical terms are assessed, monitored, reported, and disclosed. Same thing. In the methodology that we have for the private sector, we measure this and how much involvement there is of the management board on the revision of the ethical behavior of the company. Is it a subject of discussion or not in routine, ordinary sessions of the management board and of their committees? How much the senior management of the company is responsible for monitoring and for disclosing information in case of conflicts of interest, for instance, or on ethical subject matters. For instance, operations with related parties that specifically in Mexico are very common given the shareholding structures of the largest and most representative companies. So what type of policies there are around these operations with related parties, who reviews them, how they are decided on, and how conflicts of interests are revealed and disclosed. Since they had to take place with every related party, and that's just an example. But public sector entities in Mexico have a long way to go, at least in Mexico. And my fifth and last recommendation, or the last one of OECD for state-owned enterprises, and it reads that the boards of SOEs should be composed so that they can exercise objective and independent judgment. And this recommendation is 1 page long, but I summarize it by saying that this implies that they should be unconnected with the highest levels of government and therefore appointed on the basis of professional merits. And we are years behind. I don't think only Mexico, I think that many countries around the world, but we are far away from doing something like this. Meaning, in a private company, appointment of independent board members comes from the shareholders' assembly, depending on the percentage of shares they have. And usually they own at least a good share of market shares. Of course, the funds of institutional investors almost never own a large percentage. Never the majority, of course, but it's never large. They own less than 1%. So they need to appoint a management board member. Of course, in a public sector entity, this is not only idealistic, it's also not practical, and it's complicated. So the proposal that has been pretty well accepted in discussions in this type of forums is to create an office for appointing and developing boards, management boards, following and bringing professional practices in the appointment of corporate governance in the public sector. Therefore, an office in charge of writing the long list of citizens who comply with specific profile, not only for a state-owned enterprise, but also, in my opinion, for those agencies or institutions that render public services in such a way that the members of the management board can comply with this recommendation, that is not to depend on senior levels of government of the entity we're talking about. And therefore, when identifying the size, the composition, the areas of expertise necessary to be a member of the management board of this type of entities, then this type of officers could also identify and recruit qualified individuals to serve on corporate governance boards for this type of institutions. And finally, they should also play a role in the promotion and support of effective results of corporate governance, first with an annual evaluation, as Maritza from Medellin said, that they do an annual evaluation of all of the members of the board they appoint for this type of office that works pretty well over there, and also to give training and support to the members of management boards of this type of entities. And this is it. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Jorge. Your ideas are very interesting. You start from a very interesting principle. A public enterprise, of course, should have more responsibility and accountability at a higher level compared against a private company. And then you refer to the document that not all state-owned enterprises are alike, that there are different types of state-owned enterprises, and therefore this forces us to have a different regulatory framework for all of these companies and not to treat them all alike. And finally, you talk about authentic corporate governance with the characteristics you've said that differentiate it from other countries where corporate governance are public officers of the government themselves. And then you say, well, are we going to ask or demand from them more responsibility, transparency, accountability, better reports, specific corporate governance? And then we also need to think if then this regime applies to them and how, up to what extent, and what is the differentiation. This is an underlying subject for discussion. And now I pass the floor to our third speaker, Mr. Wanwan Seiful Chan, who is the Chief Executive of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. He's also Director of the Southeast Asian Network for Development and Chairman of the Istanbul Network for Liberty. He also has broad experience. He's been very active in this subject matter, and I thank him for his participation this afternoon for 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Gracias por la presentación.
To my presentation, because we don't have much time, I'm going to do 4 things in this presentation. One is to introduce, just give us some very basic background to state-owned enterprises in Malaysia, that we can understand the context of my presentation, and then outline some initiatives that the government has taken to promote good governance in the country. And then there's this case study that I think is just not complete if I don't present it, which is the case of a state-owned enterprise called 1MDB, One Malaysia Development Berhad, Development Limited, which is a company in Malaysia, a major state-owned enterprise that is making a lot of, that's creating a lot of political problems for the government in the country now, and then some lessons learned. But let me just start by saying that the nature of state-owned enterprises in Malaysia is a rather complex one. We have so many of them, to the extent that, I'm a bit embarrassed when I hear other speakers saying we have this number of state-owned enterprises, we have that number of state-owned enterprises, this is the number at the federal level, this number of state level, because I simply do not know how many state-owned enterprises that we have in the country. Yesterday when I was walking in town, I was handed this leaflet, Tony Roma's restaurant. In Malaysia, this is a state-owned enterprise. So, that's how pervasive a state-owned enterprise is. Malaysian government owns 87% of this company, of the franchise holder, and so on. But in short, there are 2 types of state-owned enterprises. One is those that are 100% owned by the government, and another one that are owned by the companies that are 100% owned by the government. So there are 7 major ones, 7 really big state-owned enterprises. We call them government-linked investment companies. These are the likes of Khazanah, who I'm sure many of you are aware of. In fact, some of the work by Khazanah is quoted by the OECD, the National Pension Fund, the Civil Service Pension Fund, the Armed Forces Pension Fund, and so on. There's 7 of them. They, in turn, invest in other companies and set up other companies, and we call them GLCs, government-linked companies. So you drop the word investment, you know that there are 7 GLICs, government-linked investment companies. As soon as you drop the word investment from the name, you completely lose count of how many there are. Because at the federal level, I think at the last count, people say there are between 400 to 500. But Malaysia also has 13 states, and each state will have hundreds more of state-owned enterprises operating at that sub-national level. So that's the nature and how pervasive state-owned enterprises is in Malaysia. Now, the government acknowledges that there is a need for state-owned enterprises to be governed well. And the OECD study, I was flicking through one of the papers just now, and it quotes one of the projects run by one of the initiatives set up by the government called the Putrajaya Committee on GLC High Performance. Now, this was launched in May 2004, and it completed its work at the end of 2015. And they produced a few guidelines, and they're very good guidelines. If you read the books, if you read guidelines, they are really good ones. They call it Green Book, Blue Book, Red Book. And there is also another one that I forgot to mention here, which is a Silver Book, which is on the guideline for state-owned enterprises to be involved in CSR activities. They basically outline, the purposes of state-owned enterprise, what they should be doing, how they should focus on performance, and so on. Now, the PCG, the committee that was set up, the program was actually very successful. In terms of total shareholder return, it grew by 11%. Market capitalization grew. You can see the numbers on the slides there. Tax revenue, about 63 billion ringgit, which is about 15 billion US dollars was paid. Revenue from overseas grew from 28% to 34%. But one thing that many people do not mention when they talk about this committee is the fact that it only focuses on the top 20 GLCs in the country. It's not for all. So, I don't know how many there are. Let's say if there are 2,000 of them. So this committee, this initiative only focuses on 1% of the state-owned enterprises that exist in the country. There are thousands more that are not covered by this initiative. So we need to acknowledge that there have been some very good work done by the government. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge the limitation as well. There is also another initiative that I think is important to mention here, which is something called the National Transformation Program that was launched by the Prime Minister in 2010. One of the strategic reform initiatives, one of the key agenda under this National Transformation Program was to reduce government's role in business. Now, the government, the Prime Minister was very outspoken, very succinct in outlining why it needs to be done, why the role of government in business needs to be reduced, and so on. And there was supposed to be a three-pronged approach, which is number one, to clearly establish the government's role in business. I guess this is in line with principle number 1 of the OECD guideline, which is that there must be a rationale for state ownership of a company. Then there was supposed to be a clear divestment plan, and there is also a need to produce a clear governance guideline for government ministry and SOEs. We did a study, Ideas, the organization that I run is an independent organization. We work very closely with the government, especially the people in the Prime Minister's Department and the Treasury as well. But we are an independent organization, and I guess the reason why people from government come to us is because of that independence. And we did a study. We released a study the day after the Prime Minister announced that they have achieved all the targets in reducing government's role in business. And the day after that, we released a study that says that actually the government has failed miserably in achieving their own targets because the ownership, the shareholding actually doubled over the period of the program, and in terms of control, the government is much more pervasive than what they were before the Prime Minister started the program. So I guess the point that I'm saying here is the initiative are really good on paper when it's published, when it's announced, when it's discussed, when it's presented to the public. The initiatives are really good, and they really cut to the point of what needs to be done in order to improve governance and enhance government's role in business. But in terms of actual implementations, there are limitations. And that doesn't bring me. Okay. So the various efforts done by the government have produced mixed results. I'm trying to be as positive as I can in saying that. But the mixed result is because most attention has been focused on the top SOEs only. The ones at the state level are almost completely ignored. There are still thousands of SOEs that are not covered. And it is very easy to get the good news about the achievements because this is what people tend to promote. But when you try to research the reality on the ground, what is actually happening in terms of achieving those policies, those measures that the government wants to achieve, I think even finding the data is not very easy. Now, I cannot run away from mentioning this. This is the case study of One Malaysia Development Berhad. The word Berhad means limited. The case of 1MDB is not something that I'm very proud of, but at least I hope, come 10, 15 years in the future, it will be one of the best corporate governance case study that can be discussed, because there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from it on what not to do. 1MDB is a company that was set up by the government. It was presented as a pet project of the current Prime Minister. It's supposed to be a strategic development fund whose role is to bring foreign direct investment into the country. It is owned by Ministry of Finance Incorporated. So it's a state-owned enterprise. Ministry of Finance Incorporated is a state-owned enterprise itself. It owns 100% of 1MDB. So the intention was really good, but there was various allegations of wrongdoing that has been thrown towards 1MDB. That led to the Parliament Public Accounts Committee setting up their own investigation into this, and they published a report a few months ago, and they found that there have been various issues surrounding 1MDB, but some of the allegations that led to that investigation by the PAC is that the company 1MDB has failed to service its loans. It needed to be bailed out by the Ministry of Finance. The company went into agreements without proper due diligence. It made false statements to the public, and there was suspicious behavior as well, in the sense that the auditor just, as soon as they come to the deadline of publishing the audit report, they were sacked and replaced by someone else, and that someone else was sacked as well as soon as they come close to the extended deadline, until they eventually publish one. But the Auditor General, the Chief Auditor of the country, was also asked to audit the accounts of 1MDB. And for unknown reasons, this is the only report by the Auditor General that until today is classified as an official secret and not allowed to be tabled in Parliament like other reports by the Auditor General. So the PAC eventually published its report, not without controversies, but to me it's a good report. Those who are hoping for more political damage to the government would be unhappy with the report, but I'm quite happy with it because I think the report outlines some failures or some weaknesses that we really should address. And among the items identified by the PAC report is the Prime Minister chairs the advisory board of the company. And this creates a question on how much control does the board actually has. So the conversation we've been having throughout the day is about evaluating the performance of the board, how the board has to play its role, be independent, be professional, and so on. But here we have a case where the Prime Minister does not get involved in the board at all, but chairs the advisory board. And it creates an issue of whether there is a shadow directorship in the company. The PAC report also found that the CEO of 1MDB repeatedly ignored directive on the board. So they found that the board decided like this, and the CEO decided to do just something else. But the CEO continued to be in his place despite the repeated ignoring of directive from the board. And at the same time, 1MDB, and especially the subsidiaries of 1MDB, has a lot of privileges, tax exemptions, and loan guarantees issued by the Ministry of Finance. This, again, is another question because the Prime Minister in Malaysia is also the Minister of Finance. So, there's a question of who is really in charge. Now, 1MDB has a debt of 12 billion US dollars. The government is denying this, but I think eventually it will have to be bailed out by the government using taxpayers' money. I think in terms of the lessons that can be learned, regardless of whatever is being published, the guidelines, how glossy papers are that the guidelines are published, how presentable the guidelines are, how flashy the events are to publish the guidelines and so on. There is a need to be a bit more vigilant when it comes to state-owned enterprises. It is not enough to be talking among ourselves, I think. There is a need to get a wider involvement, especially from the public in discussing this. There is a need to keep an eye on government behavior, especially if we're talking about reports and guidelines published by the government itself. In terms of roles and responsibilities, again, it needs to be clearly clarified. I don't think I need to go into this because the OECD guideline is detailed enough on this, so it's about the governance structure. But there is this question, and I'm really interested when I look at the OECD guideline to see that in the booklet that's handed out to you on page 17 is, guideline item number 1, which is rationale for state ownership. And I think this really raises a question on, is there a real rationale for government to be involved or set up or continue to be involved in certain state-owned enterprises? And what can be done when that rationale no longer exists, or that rationale simply does not exist that justifies the creation of a new one? So I think while governance is an issue, it is also timely to ask whether we actually need SOEs at all. But that is a bigger issue, but I think it just needs to be raised as well. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por la.
Thank you for your participation. It is a clear example of the problems of the proliferation of SOEs, up to the extent that, as he said, in Malaysia, you don't know how many there are. It's not the only country in the world. In this same country at a federal level, we had hundreds of SOEs at a federal level. Today, of course, there are fewer, but at a state and municipal level, we still don't precisely know how many there are. But beyond that, the example of this company highlights many of the subjects that have been debated on about corporate governance of companies, mainly what was said if officers or prime ministers or ministers are ideal for corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. Therefore, we can continue with our discussion, and I open the Q&A session for our panel speakers or any comments that you would like to make. So, we can answer one first question, please. Thank you, Sergio. My question is for Jorge. I was very interested in this presentation from the private approach, and specifically this very first point where you talked about this due diligence or this moral debt of transparency and accountability of state-owned enterprise, even more than private companies. The guidelines the OECD has developed along the years could somehow lead to not a contradiction, but rather we should deal with them equally, private and public companies, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of not having this dual role, to separate their role as a regular state. Do you foresee a risk on the implementation of this differentiated thing of transparency or surveillance, or on giving more freedom to act as private companies and to make them as competitive as private ones in competitive sectors? Because maybe there is a dichotomy or friction. I don't know what you think about this. I think that for merely commercial enterprises such as Pemex or CFE, the level of accountability they need to have is pretty clear, and it's the same one as a publicly listed company, and they do it because they issue that with the same institutional investors as Telmex or America Móvil. These are the retirement funds of all of us, the ones that are invested in that debt many a times. And the reality is that the disclosure level is done as private companies do. Maybe not with the frequency as a company would do in terms of stock calendars, to call it somehow, but I would go one step beyond, because actually these are the least, and the more are the ones that render public services, those without a commercial aim. And there it is worth differentiating, and obviously we need to give them much more freedom. Commercial ones, the level of freedom they have is they compete, they win the competition, and they give a good service, and therefore they follow the same competitive rules the market provides. So the market kind of regulates that, and I agree with you. They don't need more regulation. Maybe they just need a little bit more transparency, for instance, in terms of appointing independent advisors, assessing the management board, separating these independent advisors from top management government levels for them to be independent, but that's the least, even if the company is large. The rest is the worst part, because there are many public services, and here's where we need more freedom in the sense of citizens' involvement. When I refer to an office profiling who needs to be independent advisors of the Mexican Post Office or of the State University in Hidalgo, what you want there is participation of citizens in the area. And in this sense, this openness is what we hope for. What you see in provinces in Canada and in many northern countries and in the US, in many places around the world, in Medellin, and you don't see that in Mexico at a state level or at a municipal level. Just what I said a while ago, I've never been able to list all of the entities that render public services at a municipal level, for instance, or at a state level. At a federal level, of course, there are few, and there this is much more controlled. Federal controls are very demanding in this sense and appropriate, but at a state level it's much more complex, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that'd like to ask? Well, this is also the same topic as Jorge's, just a comment that I can't resist to share. I think this is the type of scenario where we should also reflect on the adequate level of bureaucracy that public companies are imposed. Most of the times, this is part of the problem. Today we have a huge representation of public companies, but corporate issues, corporate governance issues have both ends. Situations where the state-owned company is not demanded for anything, and as a consequence they have a situation that provide unfair levels above the private sector, or on the other hand it demands for a bunch of things that turn it into non-competitive because they have to provide information to the competition, or because they have to fill out a bunch of documents and controls that force for the public company situation turns into an inefficient one, and it is non-competitive. So I think that this is also a reflection that we have to arrive to in this sort of scenario. What would be the right level and what would be the right balance in terms of corporate governance so that we do not end up sinking the public company or the state-owned company? Yes, please go ahead, Andres. I have a question related to demands, but not specifically on transparency and information, but in what has to do social environment. I want to ask what you've seen here in Mexico. Have you ever found circumstances where public companies go for certifications by organizations such as Empresas B or Capitalismo Consciente that can certify before the citizen the scope of this wheel? Or do you believe that these sort of certifications don't apply and that it should be within the genesis of public-owned companies? Well, my experience is very limited, and maybe they should answer that question over there. But for example, Pemex, the Mexican oil company, Pemex submits a report of corporate sustainability. It has social responsibility practices, environmental responsibility, etc., certified by different national and international audit organizations or entities that are very demanding compared to the most important companies that are trading in the stock market, here or any other country. I think that this is something very positive. I think that these sort of certifications add value in terms of accountability and transparency towards citizenships, which are the shareholders of this company. That's what I would say, but I'm sure that Sergio knows more about it. Max, Sergio, I don't know. Max, no? Well, I would like to add, but I think Pemex's and CFE example is perfect in terms of registrations that should be presented and made public. Also, a couple of years ago, there was a reform on development banks' obligations, so we would also add 8 more Mexican SOEs, where, in the same way, they have a lot of obligations to apply corporate governance as well as to provide disclosure on certain reports that are periodically submitted and that also participate in the financial sector, and this also has an impact within the financial sector itself. And we would also discuss the dichotomy in terms of regulating your own company. So there are very clear guidelines on markets, activities, as well as the registration of people that could work in those companies. So we also had progress in these practices in terms of development banking. Now, in terms of the rest of the federal companies, truth be told, I think that the next challenge that the country could have in terms of the distinction that the panel members were mentioning goes about identifying which ones are worthwhile considering in terms of giving the next step so they can foster better practices on corporate governance. Any other questions? Comments? Oh, sorry. Hans or? Oh, Anna.
Thank you for the presentations. I just wanted to make 2 brief comments. First, I'm always hesitant to take the floor on state-owned enterprises because the United States actually doesn't have any entities that we label as state-owned enterprises. We have government corporations established by Congress to perform a public purpose. So these provide a product or service intended to produce revenues that meet or approximate expenses. Examples of those in the U.S. are Amtrak, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, also the U.S. Postal Service. We've got 21 federally mandated enterprises. None of the U.S. government corporations engage in economic activities across borders in competition with the private sector. So it's been very interesting for me to hear about the challenges when you're in the commercial sphere, and somewhat grateful that we're out of the commercial sphere and having to deal with this. Then I wanted to just make you aware of an initiative. This is a global initiative, the Global Enterprise Registration Project. I think all of you have been handed out this. And this is an initiative in order to encourage governments to put administrative processes online and to make them clear and simple. And it starts with business registration, but the concept applies to all government processes. In the context of state-owned enterprises and our discussion of efforts to avoid and limit corruption, this can be a good practical step to reduce opportunities for corruption if state-owned enterprises kind of act as leaders in encouraging their governments to put administrative processes online and to make them clear and simple. Because those state-owned enterprises that are operating in the commercial sphere should have to go through the same processes as a private sector company in terms of getting licenses and permits. That's a best practice. So you would experience the difficulty in many countries of getting those licenses and permits, and then as part of the government, be in a position to say, why don't we streamline, why don't we make this easier? And so in the same way it would improve the environment for doing business for the state-owned enterprise, it would also improve the environment overall for doing business. So I hope you'll take a look at the flyer and that this is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Adelante, por favor. María.
Gracias. Retomando un poco el tema de la integración de los conceptos.
Management councils for commercial companies, I'd like to add the fact that yes, it's true that we are going over personalization and trying to have a different integration. I'd like to clarify on the fact that most of the times the participation of some public servants in management councils or advisorships has to do sectorial policies that commercial societies are guided by. In Mexico, for example, we are in a specific stream because we are talking about management councils and government entities that are completely integrated by public servants. And yes, we lose objectivity. We are incorporating little by little different independent advisors, and we just did it at Pemex, CFE, Development Banking, and in some companies such as the Oil Mexican Institute, which are not completely commercial, but it would be good to reflect on the fact that we should equilibrate and balance and integrate experience and the need of sectorial political coordinations with the need of objective independence in terms of these councils. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting point, the balance between public and private sectors. Max? I'd like to add a comment on transparency and disclosure that has been discussed. One of the reflections would be, evidently, what Jorge has already mentioned in terms of market control and market access and everything that has to do with values regulation, etc., has a transparency in itself. However, public companies are also directed by everything that has to do with transparency laws and legislations, and all of the government transparency laws. So in this sense, at least from the point of view of design and institution, theoretically speaking, they should have a major scrutiny because regulation applies to them and they have to respond to it. So I don't know if maybe Dr. Lopez, that's an expert in this topic, could address this question, but we would have to combine the public audience in these terms of accountability reports, etc., as well as the market. So there's a sort of a double regulation that should bring us to the result that this is more transparent and this should be more scrutinized, but it's not necessarily clear to me if it is. I think that in an institutional industry design, it would bring us to a situation where they are over-regulated in that field, but I don't know if there is any reaction or answer to this proposition. Would anyone like to add something? Yes, actually, I want to say something myself. This is part of the problem. I think that not only transparency regulations, but all of the regulations are simultaneously applied to private governance corporate practices. So at the end of the day, it is the collision of two worlds, because on one hand you are subject to a regulation that is created for other purposes, and at the same time you want for it to work on the corporate governance. So how can you match ethics codes or integrity policies when simultaneously you have responsibility laws, management ones that are applicable to companies? So I think that part of the problem is that we are still having this dilemma between where to locate these companies and the idea of realizing that not all government companies do the same. Some of them are closer to the market, others not so close. So this could start helping us providing criteria to regulate it differently. And at some point, we could even think that corporate government practices, private ones, are going to be enough elements, but always posing the difficulty of who's the stakeholder and the shareholder in a public-owned company on one hand. And on the other hand, there are government companies that are closer to being authorities that render services, hence their operation logic is different. That's just something I wanted to share as an additional topic. Anyone else that'd like to share comments, questions? Well, it's 6 o'clock, so I think we've had a very hard-working day. We are all gonna take home very important ideas, but now it's time to think upon it, and at 7 p.m. we will have a toast and a cocktail where with a good whiskey and a glass of wine, maybe ideas can flow better. So thank you very much. Good afternoon. Bueno, entonces, usted me ha pedido que comente situaciones de logística finales. ¿Cómo concluyó Sergio? El cóctel es a las 7 p.m.
For all of you that are staying in the Zócalo area, it's just at the counter corner of this corner of the Zócalo. It's just this street all the way ahead. And we will be giving you shuttle service back to your hotels after the cocktail. The sun is up after the little rain we had. So you might be able to have a nice walk through the main square. And also, Katrina, I don't know if you might want to make the announcement regarding the evaluation form, or you were provided with an evaluation form for the event, and if you can fill it out and hand it in to Katrina, or take it home with you and then scan it and send it to her email address, that would be, then she will provide it accordingly. And finally, for all of you that won't be participating in the event tomorrow, just a reminder that there will be a guided tour of Palacio Nacional for anyone who's interested. At 6 o'clock, we will part from here right after the sessions are over with. Thank you very much for this great day. The cocktail will serve tequila, mezcal, and red and white wine, Sergio, for your amusement.